One comment about my game that I got multiple times was both that it felt like GoldenEye and that the gunplay was bad. So I've gone and actually done something about it, adding new guns as well as making the guns bigger and moving them closer to the camera, adding animations and casings that get ejected when shooting, as well as adding play arms that hold the guns. Additionally, I also overhauled the existing gunplay mechanics, adding some much needed features and improving the ones that already existed. Even though it's not entirely complete yet, as I still need to make some minor tweaks so that the player isn't breaking their elbow when they're holding a gun, for example, and so that the fingers properly grip the gun. But as you can see in this little comparison, it is a really big improvement, if I'm allowed to toot my own horn. Though, before we continue, I'm Thor and I'm solo developing Scorching Engines, a game set aboard a giant vehicle in a frozen, post-apocalyptic wasteland where I have to fight for your survival. Transporting a large heat core to humanity's colony to save them from the permanent global winter, whilst the raiders attacking you want it for themselves. If that sounds interesting, you can wishlist the game on Steam with the link in the description, as wishlists play a huge role in a game's potential success, and seeing people being interested in the game makes me enjoy the development process even more. Additionally, you are very welcome to join the Discord to see more frequent updates, as well as providing feedback before and during development of new features. It's still not the final version for the gunplay, as I like to work in an iterative and expanding kind of workflow, so I get the bare minimum of a feature working before working on the next feature, and then I can come back and improve it in multiple iterations. I like doing this as I find that it allows me to more easily see if a feature is needed and if it improves the rest of the game, and by having it be bare bones for a while, I can more easily judge what's needed in a future improvement. Another benefit is that I don't end up wasting time with polish, as I never reached the polishing phase of unneeded features, such as the voxel pathfinding, which had to be scrapped before I implemented path smoothing and other niceties. So I guess that this would probably be Gun Overhaul V2, as the V1 was adding sway and bobbing to the gun when walking, as well as VFX when shooting in the form of muzzle flash and bullet impact sparks, as well as different bobbing and sway per gun, so that heavier guns can move more slowly and feel like they actually have some weight. However, like I mentioned, I haven't just added new guns this time around. I've also rewritten large parts of the pre-existing gun implementation so that different guns can have different stats, as before they were a bit hard-coded. So now guns can have different amount of bullets shot per shot, so the shotgun can shoot multiple pellets. On top of this, I have also made it so that you can actually aim a gun instead of just hip firing, which is pretty important when it's a first-person shooter. Additionally, I have made the very controversial decision to add random bullet spread on top of the randomized procedural recoil. However, I have limited it to only affect your hipfire shooting, as bullets not hitting where you're aiming is absolutely horrendous. Shotguns still have spread when aiming, but that's because that's how a shotgun works, the pellets, they spread. On top of this aiming, I have, as you can see, added a field of view zoom effect and removed the crosshair when aiming, so that you have to use the iron sights. There will, however, be an accessibility feature to always show the crosshair, in case some people prefer that. With this, we can now also have snipers with a much larger zoom than normal guns, which means that you can now shoot enemies from a distance. Since I'm using projectile-based bullets instead of raycasts, it means that I also needed to up the bullet velocity for the sniper quite a bit, so that you can actually shoot the distances required. Unfortunately, this has caused my bullet collision detection to be a bit finicky when shooting things close by with a sniper. In the process of fixing that, I also rewrote some of the collision logic and optimized it to do fewer checks unless absolutely necessary. Which means that bullet collision detection is now even cheaper. So the 1 million bullets that I could process at 30 FPS in Devlog 2 is potentially even higher, as back then it was the collision detection that was the biggest bottleneck. And it's not just a small performance improvement. In this small test where I shoot 600,000 bullets off of a platform, the time to process all collision checks went down from 11.5 milliseconds to 4.5 milliseconds, which is a massive 150% speed up or 60% time reduction. Not that I ever anticipate somebody having 600,000 active bullets in my game, but with all the enemies, turrets and guns, that can be a couple of hundred bullets. But I refuse to let the shooting part of my first person shooter be a bottleneck. And it was only like an hour or two of work on a Saturday afternoon to optimize it. Since I want the gunplay to feel like a weird mix of Metro, Apex and Far Cry, the guns are somewhat powerful, but I haven't quite gone for the whole one headshot being enough to kill, regardless of the gun used. As in Metro, you can easily just sneak through a camp and kill everybody with like 10 bullets in total. I have, however, made the sniper be able to kill in one headshot, but 2 body shots, and 3 leg shots if your aim is bad. But I'll probably tweak it some more and most likely make headshots be more lethal. As right now it's 6 body shots with an AK and 3 headshots, which does feel a bit high, but it all depends on how the gunplay actually feels, and not just what feels realistic. But I am leaning towards the whole one shot to the head, except for maybe some enemy types with head armor. On top of this, I have also made it so guns affect your movement speed when equipped, so that a sniper rifle makes you run more slowly than a pistol, especially when aiming, as that further reduces your movement speed, as well as preventing you from being able to run. And, just like in every other devlog, I'm here to say that using Unity dots made development very difficult. Because just like with every other feature, there is no built-in dots equivalent for animations. Which is pretty bad when you're trying to animate guns shooting and hands holding them. Luckily, this is planned and is on Unity's roadmap, but it's nowhere near being released. I could of course just use a game object gun and arms and use the built-in animation package, together with a bunch of scripts to trigger code correctly, since the animation events need to trigger code in order to spawn VFX and casings, and with game object animations you can just normally write the name of the function they should call and it just works. Unfortunately, I can't do that, as it needs to trigger code in my dots systems. Though, luckily, the same asset that I'm using for animating the enemies and their ragdolls also works for this use case. The Rakanka asset that I'm using has built-in support for sending animation events into a buffer that you just need to check every frame for events and then trigger the correct code based on the event ID. What I'm using this for is to spawn the SFX and VFX when you're shooting, so that the animation lines up with when the gun shoots. This is pretty apparent with the pistol, as the gun won't shoot before the hammer on the back of the gun strikes, which happens a couple of frames after left-clicking to shoot. However, I have made a somewhat weird decision, which is that the bullets get shot immediately when you click, even though the bullet shooting SFX and VFX won't play for a couple of frames later, depending on your frame rate, and when they show up in the animation clip. This is done so that you will actually hit your target, and won't run into situations where you shoot and then move your mouse, causing the bullet to hit where you moved your mouse to, instead of where you were aiming when you clicked. As it would both feel very bad with a noticeable input lag, and it would also make it much harder to aim, as you'd need to lead your shots even more and wouldn't be able to predict the fire rate delay that well. Another nice little feature is that I made the guns eject casings that fall on the ground and trigger impact sounds. Currently, there's only one sound the casings play, regardless of the material they land on, but I will be fixing that, so it's a nice muffled snow when you're shooting outside. However, getting inverse kinematic hands to work with the animation asset was a bit of a hassle, as there were some bugs that shouldn't have been happening, to say the least, and some minor incompatibilities, but once I figured them out, it was actually pretty decent. However, since I'm currently using full IK instead of animations together with IK, there are some oddities. such as the fact that the player hand doesn't quite hold guns, but I will be fixing that. Though I'm probably going to go down the animation plus IK route, instead of doing only IK, but due to me not knowing how to animate and not wanting to spend a lot of money on animations, IK seemed like a pretty decent solution for the moment. All the guns in my game, however, cannot share the same IK targets, as a pistol doesn't have a handguard thingy to hold on to, and therefore I had to quickly make a system that swaps IK targets based on the currently held gun, where when you don't hold a gun, the arms get hidden behind the player. Currently it's also only player arms, but I do want to add legs later, as being able to see your legs and feet is pretty immersive and it would look a lot better, especially when sliding down hills in the snow. I did try to find free gun assets with animations, and there are a few that do work, but a lot of them are very different in their style and look, and some are incompatible due to mismatching arm models and gun rigs, which would lead to the player having different arms when swapping between guns. This can however also be fixed by retargeting the animation onto a shared arm setup, but it's a lot of hassle and a lot of work with a skill that I'm very bad at. However, me being me, I couldn't stick to the topic and I accidentally reworked the terrain deformation because it was causing lag spikes at every game startup, which made working on the gun overhauled pretty annoying. So despite me saying in the last devlog that it wasn't that bad, it was actually that bad. Especially when you have to deal with the lag spikes again and again and again. Additionally, it's also because I felt bad for using a really poorly made brute force solution that just did thousands of raycasts per chunk. So the new solution does 0 raycasts for deformation, and instead finds the closest deformer that is inside of and gets deformed according to its deformer component. Removing all of the memory allocations from the raycasts, as well as the CPU load from not doing the raycasts, gave us a pretty massive performance increase. On top of this, I also discovered a Unity API that I didn't know of, which I could use to get the vertices of a mesh without doing any garbage collector allocations. As before, I was manually copying it over to a native array with unsafe code, which could cause crashes if I had messed something up. The reason for doing that is that you need a native array instead of a normal array for burst compilation compatibility, which I want as it gives a massive performance increase. Doing this saved us 157 kilobytes of GC allocations per terrain chunk, which is pretty massive, as during a normal frame, it's sitting at less than a single kilobyte of allocations. All of these changes, plus some other minor optimizations that I'm skipping, but you can see in the Discord, brought the time to deform a single terrain chunk down from 11.5 milliseconds to 0.3 milliseconds, which is a speed up of 3,800% or 97.5% less time to deform a terrain chunk. In other words, I should be ashamed of the previous implementation. But I guess I accidentally just became a modern developer that doesn't care about optimization. But unfortunately, now the biggest performance bottleneck for terrain deformation is the generation of colliders. Even more unfortunately is that if I wanted that to be faster, I have to fork Unity.physics and create my own collider generation code. I did however discover that if I turn off safety checks for collider generation, I can get a speed up of roughly 60%. I just have to be careful so that it doesn't crash the game. All of this combined now brings the time to deform a terrain chunk down from 20 milliseconds to less than 6 milliseconds, where 16 milliseconds is the limit for 60 FPS. And the last new feature of the terrain deformation is that I fixed a pretty bad issue caused by deformers overlapping from a top-down perspective, leading to gaps in the world. As it caused a terrain chunk to get deformed multiple times, but only able to be deformed by a single deformer at a time. This bug is now gone, and I've replaced it with a feature where I can now specify the deformation order so that I can layer multiple deformations on top of each other. Me going down the terrain deformation rabbit hole again, isn't just because I like optimization, but because I'm going to be needing that feature for when I implement Humanity's Colony, as it's going to deform a bunch of terrain chunks. What this also means is that since the actual deformation is taking such a small amount of time, 0.3 milliseconds, I can maybe parallelize the collider generation, since that's the part that takes the longest. This would make it so that we can deform multiple chunks per frame, so that the slight frame rate dips last for a shorter amount of time, but that will wait until the colony if and when it's needed. Currently, the 4 different guns in my game each have their own ammo type. Assault rifle, pistol, shotgun and sniper rifle ammo. However, currently the only way you can get ammo is by shooting the raiders and taking their ammo. Except for the fact that almost a year ago I added a crafting system to the game and forgot to say anything about it in the devlogs, so here we are. In order to prevent players from getting softlocked, I made it so that they can craft a new AK as well as ammunition for it. Additionally, you also need to craft ammo for the turrets on the vehicle. However, I am unsure if I should make you able to craft any of the new guns, or if you can only find them in the bandit camps and then have to craft ammo for them at the crafting station, as it would give you more things to do and hopefully make the gameplay more interesting, as you need to attack bandit camps to get new guns, and then harvest resource zones for wood and coal, visit cities to collect scrap metal from the ruined cars, or harvest enemy vehicles after blowing them up in order to have resources to craft the new ammo types. The idea is that in the future I can expand this so you'll be able to craft consumables here, such as grenades, perhaps different ammo types, and other niceties. The crafting works in a pretty simple, but hopefully pretty decent way, where when you interact with the crafting station, you open the crafting menu, which is very rudimentary and very much placeholder at the moment. In this menu, you can then see what you can craft, how much of that item you craft, and what resources you need to craft it. When you then click on a crafting recipe, it gets added to the crafting queue. This queue is then processed by a system that cross-references the required resources for the recipe with the items in the crafting bench's inventory. This cross-referencing part is actually using the same method as the building system for the turrets, which is something that I wrote 5 years ago for a Rust-alike building system for a game idea I never did anything with, where you simply just specify how much of each item you need without needing to worry about the stack sizes or anything. So I can say that something needs 500 wood and 50 stone, even though wood only stacks to 100. On top of this, I have made it so that you can have multiple crafting benches, and if the crafting queue is empty, they can get disabled so that the crafting system skips them and saves on performance. This means that I could theoretically have crafting benches in city ruins with special recipes that you can't craft aboard the ship. That is if I add the logic to separate the recipes per bench, as right now they use the same global recipe list. Though, as you can see, currently the enemies are still only using an AK as their gun, but that will hopefully change so that they also use a variety of guns. But unfortunately, that's a task for another devlog. But it would be really cool to see enemies with different guns, for example an enemy raider in a guard tower with a sniper rifle, so that you have to be careful on how you approach, and perhaps have to wait until nighttime. However, unfortunately time is limited as I have a full-time job, so I haven't been able to actually get any progress done on the enemies, except for making them realize that they have been shot, and actually shoot back at the player. But that's the end of the devlog, and now I get to start developing the ending of the game, which is Humanity's Colony, and I finally get to have a complete game loop after 2.5 years of development. If you found the devlog or the game interesting, you are very welcome to wishlist it on Steam, as we're currently sitting at 297 wishlists, and those are a really important factor in a game's potential success. Alternatively, you can subscribe here on YouTube so you don't miss any future updates, and if you have any feedback or ideas, I would love to hear them, either here as a comment or on the Discord server. Thank you all very much for your support, and thanks for watching.